Welcome back to our study of the book of Revelation. This is session 3. Have you ever lived in a town or visited a town that has experienced a great natural disaster? Where you can walk down the street and see cracks in building facades left over from earthquakes, just to name an example. Or see scorch marks from a fire from many years before. I remember going to Galveston, Texas. We went to Galveston, Texas a number of years ago, just 5 or 6 years ago, and in that coastal city in Texas, there are buildings with high water marks. In the hurricane of this year, here's how high the flood got. In the hurricane of another year, the flood got this high. In the hurricane of yet another year, the flood is this high. In Charleston, South Carolina, one can also see similarly cracks from previous earthquakes. And one can see steel reinforcement, iron reinforcing put in to brace up buildings against earthquake damage. This would have been the case with most of the cities addressed in Revelation. As with any book of the Bible, Revelation was written to a particular group of people at a particular time, a particular place. And part of interpretation is always a matter of trying to understand what the book would have meant to its first hearers, its first readers. Part of interpretation is always considering the setting, the destination. The Spirit compelled the Apostle John to write these words and send these letters to 7 particular churches in Asia Minor, what is modern-day Turkey. John himself received these visions, as he tells us, while he is exiled in the island of Patmos, small island in the Aegean Sea. And he addresses 7 particular churches. And we need to remember that these churches should not be understood as particular buildings on a street corner in Ephesus or Smyrna or Thyatira, etc., but rather by churches. What is implied is a collection or collections of believers that met regularly for prayer and for worship, for the Lord's Supper, etc. These 7 churches, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, these are the 7 that received letters from John. Someone today can visit the ruins for these ancient churches. They can all be visited, albeit the names are somewhat different now in most of the cases. You can't visit the ruins of the first church of Sardis or first church of Ephesus. There wouldn't have been a building as such. There was no notion of sacred space, if you will, till much later. These believers would have met in homes or in clandestine locations, but met they did. Rather, when the modern-day tourist visits Turkey, we can visit the ruins of a city. Now, like I mentioned, today these locations are known by different names. So, a traveler to Turkey today visits the ruins of ancient Smyrna by visiting Izmir. The modern city of Izmir is ancient Smyrna. The modern day city of Pergamos is ancient Pergamum. Thyatira in the ancient world is now Akhisar. Sardis in the ancient world is now Sard. Ancient Philadelphia is now Elasahur. Laodicea in the first century is now Denizli. Then, as now, there was a well-established road that connected each of these cities. I've mentioned that the Romans were great engineers and they had developed a very effective and safe roadway. So a messenger getting off a boat in Ephesus would have traveled along a well-established road that connected these cities. Getting off a boat in Ephesus from Patmos, you would travel northward and essentially make a large horseshoe, traveling some 256 miles from Ephesus all the way around to Laodicea. And to complete the journey back to Ephesus, across the bottom to make a loop, is another 100 miles or so. Very importantly, for these cities that we will consider, the first century was an era of great seismic activity. And at first glance, we might, what in the world does seismic activity have to do with anything? I don't know anything about seismic activity in the first century. Well, actually, you may know more than you think you do. Most of us have heard of Mount Vesuvius. Mount Vesuvius, the volcanic eruption that destroyed the city of Pompeii in 79 AD. Pompeii, Mount Vesuvius, was some 700 miles from these cities in Asia Minor. Someone in Sardis or Ephesus would not have felt the earth shake from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, but doubtless they would have heard the stories about it, and it is quite likely that their climate would have been changed somewhat by the eruption of this incredible volcano. Seismologists today estimate that Mount Vesuvius erupted with a power something like 100 times that of the atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Modern seismologists and historians, in scouring ancient records, find that there were earthquakes in 27 BC, 17 AD, again in year 23, 47, 53, and in 60. This was an era of great seismic activity. In 1780, when Jesus would have still been a young man, before he began his earthly ministry, an earthquake centered in Lydia caused severe damage to many of the cities of this area, including Sardis and Philadelphia. This earthquake is described by 4 different ancient writers, historians of the era, and modern scientists studying it estimate that it erupted with a power roughly 7.5 on the Richter scale. Just a few years later, the earthquake of 23 caused severe damage to the ancient city of Ephesus. Finally, in the year 60, the Roman historian Tacitus records yet another earthquake, this one known today as the Denizli Basin earthquake, that modern seismologists estimate had a magnitude of 7.0 on the Richter scale. This earthquake largely destroyed ancient Laodicea. It's interesting that Laodicea rebuilt itself without any imperial funds. They rebuilt their city without any imperial funds, but it's not known whether Rome never offered assistance at all, or whether they offered it and Laodicea was able to do it without the money. We simply don't know. A second century BC Greek writer named Strabo, had written that Laodicea was, as we might put it today, earthquake central. In all, 6 of the 7 cities that received letters in Revelation were damaged or destroyed by earthquakes in the century before Revelation was written. Only Pergamum was spared damage or destruction to earthquake. So as we read through the pages of Revelation, pay attention to things like this. Pay attention to natural disasters. There are 5 separate references to earthquakes in Revelation. Chapter 6, 8, 2 distinct earthquakes in chapter 11, and then again in chapter 16, 5 different references to earthquakes. Then pay attention to references to like a mountain that falls into the sea. Is that perhaps a symbolic way of referring to a volcano? Pay attention to these references to natural disasters, be they earthquakes or mountains falling into the sea like volcanoes. Certainly earthquakes are part of apocalyptic imagery. Earthquakes are part of apocalyptic imagery in the pages of the Old Testament. Earthquakes are part of theophany, a time or an appearance of God on the earth amongst people. Theophanies are frequently associated with earthquakes, and as we read through these pages of Revelation, we have these repeated references to earthquakes and volcanoes. This would have been particularly striking for Christians who can walk down the street and see cracks in buildings and perhaps see ruins of buildings that have been destroyed but not rebuilt. They would have lived through earthquakes. They would have heard the stories of earthquakes and volcanoes. And this would have been a perpetual reminder that even the entire created order can be shaken. That everything can be shaken, including the created order. But only one thing stands forever, the Word of our God. Enjoy your discussion.